Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to do a video in honour of the historical fiction Readathon that is happening in June this year. This is a fantastic Readathon that I am co-hosting along with Shelley Swearingen, Melinda over at Web of Stories, Brittany over at Literarily Smitten, Gloria Z. Thompson, and me. That's number 5. In order to take part, you only need to read one work of historical fiction in the month of June. However, we have decided to each offer a prompt that can guide your reading, spice it up a little bit, or just simply give yourself a little bit of extra challenge if you want it. And I had originally planned that I was going to do one video where I suggested some recommendations for each of the 5 prompts. However, I was just getting more and more excited. I was adding more and more book recommendations. And so I've ultimately decided that I'm going to do 5 separate videos, one for each of the 5 prompts. And I thought where better to start than with my own. My prompt of the 5 was to read a work of historical fiction about the arts. Now this can be theatre, film, painting, sculpture, writing, architecture, music. If the characters are in some way engaged in the arts, then it counts for this prompt. The reason I chose this prompt is that the general arts are an area of interest of mine. You know that I'm a big fan of musical theatre, and I generally find that it filters through to my historical fiction reading. I love reading about artistic people, figures who are painters or musicians or actors. I love reading about people working at their craft, the different ways that they see the world because of their artistic sensibilities. And so I have some recommendations for you. I've also got a bit of a TBR/wish list of historical fiction surrounding the arts that I would really love to pick up at some point. It may not be this month, it may be later on in my reading life, but books that I've got my eye on. And once again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are definitely other things that I am very keen to check out, and I would love to get any of your recommendations. First off, I thought I'd start with the most recent historical fiction book featuring the arts that I have read, and that is Costanza by Rachel Blackmore. This is set in 17th century Rome and follows our main character of Costanza Piccolomini, who is the wife of a sculptor who is working under Bernini. This book tracks Costanza and Bernini's very scandalous love affair and the horrific true life results when Costanza was accused of adultery. The book does get very dark towards the end, but I loved reading about Costanza and Bernini's growing relationship and how that was fueled by her wish to learn more about the world and him piquing her interest by teaching her about art, how that made her world expand outside the typical constraints for women in this time period. It just makes it all the more devastating to see Costanza slowly grow in confidence, knowing that ultimately this relationship is not going to last. Another similar story is Disobedient by Elizabeth Freemantle. This also takes place in Rome, I think just about 10 years prior to Costanza. In this we are looking at the life of Artemisia Gentileschi. Artemisia is an artist herself. She works in her father's art shop, and she is similarly feeling constricted in her life as a woman, particularly when she knows that she is much more talented than the other people in her family. Through her art, she is able to craft out a bit of freedom for herself. And once again, like Costanza, it all comes crashing down because of a man who enters her life. The artist Tassi, who we know would go on to assault Artemisia. When he refused to marry her after the assault, her family took him to court, and that meant that Artemisia had to go through excruciating torture in order to prove her own innocence. I loved reading how Artemisia would channel her emotions and her rage into her painting. I'm not going to show it on the screen now because it is pretty grisly, but if you are interested, there is a work of hers which this book suggests is her taking her own artistic revenge on Tassi, called Judith Slaying Holofernes. You read this book, you read what happened to Artemisia, and then you look at that painting and you think, yeah, deserved. Going on to a different facet of the arts, we have A Terrible Kindness by Jo Browning-Rowe. This book is set in the 1950s and 1960s, and we are looking at young William Lavery, who was brought up as a young boy chorister, being so talented that he would be invited to King's College to sing in their choir with the hopes that he would go on to make this his profession. We know when we meet him as an adult that this hasn't happened. As an adult, he works as an embalmer. The very first chapters of the book, we see him as he's called to the Aberfan disaster in order to embalm the children whose bodies were rescued from the school. This night forces him to confront his past, everything that he left behind in his childhood, not only singing, but some of the relationships with his friends and family as well. We delve back into his childhood and we get to see how much music meant to him and how when he gives it up, how much of himself is left behind. I can tell you from not being able to sing just for a week that it can feel incredibly disorientating and jarring when you have done something, when you've been able to do something for so long, to then have it taken away even for a little bit. It's like not having access to a whole part of your being. And the disorientation that William feels, even though it is his choice not to sing anymore, it's something that I can really sympathise with. And so all the while through the book, you're really cheering him on, wanting him to get back to the music that he loves so much, and to be able to reconcile his past musical life with his current life as an embalmer, even though that does mean that he has to revisit tricky territory, namely the people that he left behind. If you're a fan of Taylor Jenkins Reid, you'll know that she is no stranger to talking about people who work within the arts. In The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, we are learning, of course, about the main character of Evelyn Hugo, who is a fictional Hollywood actress during the Golden Age. We're getting to learn more about the behind behind the scenes of the 1950s, 1960s in Hollywood, expectations particularly put upon women in this time. Also with Daisy Jones and the Six, we are getting a look at a fictional band from the 1970s, how they came together and how they would break apart. A book that is very similar to Daisy Jones and the Six is the final revival of Opal and Nev by Dawnie Walton, which is once again a story about a band which is told through a patchwork quilt of different interviews. I had a great time reading both of these, despite the fact that it's not really a time period that I am quite as familiar with, particularly when it comes to music. It's not really my era, it's not really my genre. But once again, getting to learn more about bands on the road, bands on tour, the politics behind the music was really, really interesting. My final recommendation is one that I read at the beginning of the year, I know is very well loved on BookTube, and it is Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. This is set in Syracuse in 412 BC, I want to say. During the Peloponnesian War, we are following our main characters of Lampo and Galland, who are Syracusans, who every day have to walk past this pit in which captured Athenians have been left to rot in the sun. However, Galland and Lampo are quite unusual because they are big fans of Athenian theatre, Athenian drama. Despite being pleased at the fact that Syracuse recently won one of their battles and being able to lord it over the Athenians that have been captured, they are very conscious of the fact that if these Athenians die, if Athens should lose the war, then there is going to be this whole branch of Athenian drama that dies with its people. And they really don't want that to happen. And so they decide that they are going to take it upon themselves to recruit various Athenian prisoners to perform a production of Medea. And I have to say, I've gone through several theatre tech weeks and none of them have been as brutal as this. It's a really fantastic, though brutal, story of the lengths that people will go to preserve culture and the light that art can bring, even in the most dire of circumstances. So that's it for some of the books that I've read and would recommend. Now onto some of my TBR/wish list of books that I'm very keen to read within this kind of genre. I have my eye on The Painter's Daughters by Emily House, which is about the daughters of Thomas Gainsborough. 15 Wild Decembers by Karen Powell. I actually saw Katie from Books at Things reading this when we had our BookTube and meetup last week, which is fictionalization about the life of Emily Bronte. The Secret Life of William Shakespeare by Jude Morgan pretty much does as it says on the tin, a retelling of the life of William Shakespeare. Madame Matisse by Sophie Haydock, which is a story about 3 different women who were connected to the artist Henri Matisse. Rembrandt's Promise by Barbara Leahy, once again a very similar book. I believe this is about an affair between Rembrandt and the mistress that he took following his wife's death. And then finally Boy by Nicole Galland. This is a recent release about a young boy who'd worked for Shakespeare's troupe, playing all of the women's roles. Those roles were usually reserved for young boys whose voices hadn't broken yet, and how his life changes once he goes through puberty and is no longer able to perform in those roles. What is left for him in his career after that? As I say, this as a prompt just seemed like a no-brainer. Some of my favourite historical fiction reads have been within the arts, with characters who love the theatre, who love film and TV and music and art. As I say, I would love to hear any recommendations that you have for this prompt. And do you have any books on the horizon, maybe for June in the historical fiction readathon, that you're keen to check out? I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.